Okay, everybody, thank you for joining us today. If we just want to go back one slide, let's just show the title slide again. So today's webinar is Proven Study Strategies to Structure Your USMLE and Step 1 Prep. This is a joint presentation from UWorld Medical and from Elite Medical Prep. We can go to the next slide. So as you can see on the slide here, my name is Marcel Bruce Raymer. I'm one of the co-founders of Elite Medical Prep. I'm also a board-certified neuroradiologist. Today we have with us also one of the senior tutors at Elite Medical Prep, Emily Zielinski. She's also an orthopedic surgeon and soon to be spine surgeon. And we also have today with us Kelly Chopra, the business development manager at medical sales at UWorld. And we're going to be giving this joint presentation today. As we described, we're really excited for you guys to all be here. So I guess we can jump into our initial slides. Next slide. So just a little bit of background about Elite Medical Prep. We're a company that focuses on personalized tutoring for medical school exams. We work a lot with students in a one-on-one fashion, but we also have long-standing partnerships with medical schools around the world. Many of those are listed on the slide here. We focus on one-on-one tutoring and customized educational programs for a lot of different exams, including the USMLE, especially USMLE Step 1, but also the complex level exams, shelf exams, residency matching, the MCAT, and also medical school admissions. Next slide, please. So to open up our discussion today, we want to just sort of take you through a general principles slide, and this is what we have here. This is our sort of resource pyramid, as we call it. And as you can see at the top of the slide, at Elite Medical Prep and also at UWorld, as we'll discuss, active learning is really the key to all forms of learning in medical school and medical education. And we want to prioritize that by making active learning or putting active learning first and putting passive learning after. Well, what do we mean by active and passive learning? From our standpoint, active learning are those things that are going to be engaging you more actively in a more mentally active activity. And at the base of our pyramid, the core of our pyramid of resources, we can see here that questions and review, especially practice questions, high quality practice questions, the kinds that you're going to find in the UWorld Qbank, as we'll be discussing, are really should be the core of your preparation, both during your dedicated preparation for the USMLE Step 1 and other exams, but also throughout medical school. This is something that has been supported by the medical education literature. Additionally, another form of active learning would be flashcards, and UWorld is going to be, when they'll be talking about the UWorld system, they'll be talking both about the high quality of practice questions and how they obviously work in an active learning standpoint, but also flashcards. If we just go back for a second to that slide. And if we also look at this pyramid, as we get to the top, we get to the things that are smaller in emphasis, we have other kinds of resources, visual memory aids, videos and podcasts and reading, and we want to make those less of an emphasis because they're less active. So we can go to the next slide. So today we're going to talk about building a calendar for dedicated study for Step 1. And we're going to give you a step-by-step approach. And this is going to be a collaborative discussion between both Elite Medical Prep and UWorld, as we've just said. And I wanted to let Dr. Zielinski here walk us through how we set up a dedicated study calendar. We have it all laid out here, sort of the 5-week our five-week calendar. We're going to talk about that in just a second. We're going to take you through step by step how we looked at these calendars and how we overhauled it. So, Dr. Zielinski, do you want to walk us through this first slide?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we can probably go to the next slide to start by building the calendar. So kind of getting into the meat of this 5-week calendar. First question is, why 5 weeks? So we elected to set the calendar at about 5 weeks because most US and other medical schools provide students with a dedicated period of study for USMLE Step 1. That's roughly 6 weeks in length, with the addition, of adding on elective months and things like that if you need extra time. But 5 weeks will allow you to have some flexibility with setting your test date and working backwards within that dedicated window. And so we will start by kind of designing the calendar from the back, basically once you set your test date, and then moving backwards to kind of build in the rest of the days. So we can go ahead and go to the next slide. In the event that you do need some extra time, our calendar does allow does give you that 1 week of flexibility, like I said. So at the end of your test, at the end of your 5 weeks, if you're not feeling prepared for step one, you feel like you need some additional time, you will have the ability, to add on an extra week of studying if necessary, or potentially push your test date and still be within that 6-week period of what is typically allotted. So the end of our calendar, which everyone will receive a link to at the end of this webinar, does have some tips for kind of an SOS, what to do if you're not feeling prepared. But this 5-week calendar does allow for that. Okay, next slide. So to build the calendar, like I said, you want to start from the most important dates and kind of at the end. So once you've set your test date, and it is really important to pick a test date and kind of plan for about how much time you'll think you'll need. And again, we recommend 5 to 6 weeks to study for most students, unless you feel like you need more time. But if you set your test date, that gives you a goal and kind of something to be working towards. And so you want to put your test date on your calendar first, and then kind of work backwards to fill in the days leading up to your test date to set your study schedule. So you see that here on this first slide with our test date is templated for Saturday. And then next slide there, you want to then move forward by adding in additional practice test dates. So you want to start by putting in all of your most essential test dates or dates in your calendar first. So your official test date, and then moving backwards to fill in practice exams. And we recommend taking at least 3 practice exams leading up to any USMLE exam. That is to help you gain comfort and confidence as you're preparing for your exam and know that you're within passing range, because you obviously wouldn't want to sit for an exam if you weren't ready and willing and able to likely pass the exam. And that 3 practice exam total does account for both a baseline practice exam and then 1 to 2 or 2 additional practice exams before your final exam or actual test date. Here on our calendar, you can see on the right that we have input 5 or 4 different practice exams in the middle of the calendar, as well as 1 baseline practice exam, for a total of 5 practice exams if you were going to take a practice exam every week. There's a little bit of flexibility there. Again, we recommend taking at least 3, so you could take them bi-weekly if you wanted to, but you do have the flexibility here to add in extra practice exams as we've laid out. And then every day that you take a practice exam, we recommend taking that afternoon off if needed, or reviewing your exam that day or the following day. So we build in an extra day. Here on this calendar, we have practice exams scheduled for Saturday and then a review day scheduled for Sunday, so that you take time to review all of the blocks in your practice exam. And that is super important, because practice questions are not only an assessment tool, but they're also a learning tool. And so anytime you're doing practice exams, you have an opportunity to take additional practice questions, and therefore you're seeing more content asked different ways, and you're using that opportunity to learn. But learning doesn't really happen if you're not reviewing the test to see your mistakes and making sure that you've reviewed all of the material that you covered in that practice exam. So the practice exam is scheduled here for Saturdays with the review day on Sundays. And that also allows you to have some flexibility if you need to combine things in one day, if you have a family event or something like that, but gives you a little bit of flexibility in the calendar. Okay, next slide. And then once you have your baseline practice test, your final USMLE test date, and then your other practice exam dates input in the calendar, you can work to fill in the remaining days. And we recommend doing this by breaking things down by organ system. So you'll see on the calendar to the right, we've kind of allotted the first Monday and Tuesday to a cardiovascular specific focus, Wednesday, Thursday to pulm, Friday to endocrine, et cetera, so on and so forth. And we recommend filling in the days by prioritizing key topics. So you want to prioritize the topics that are most heavily tested. And those types of topics would include things like cardiovascular, pulmonary, and renal, and then probably also neuro as well. And then you can kind of also build in time early in your schedule for weaker areas. So if there are areas that show up on your baseline exam that you recognize as a weak spot or gaps in your knowledge, you might want to prioritize putting those topic focuses in earlier, so that you can review those adequately in the initial couple of weeks and really solidify your understanding of that material as you progress through your study period. Okay, next slide. And then once you've set your cardio or your topic focus for each of the days, now we want to break it down day by day. What is your day going to look like as you're preparing for USMLE Step 1? So you know that you're focusing on cardio, but what does your actual day look like? The biggest thing is to start by prioritizing, like Marcel or Dr. Bruce Romer was saying, prioritize active learning first. So whether you're a night owl or an early bird, no matter what time of day you're actually getting up to start your day, you want to make sure that you are starting your day with questions and a more active learning form. So using the UWorld question bank and prioritizing questions to start the day is really important, because that's when your mental energy is going to be best. That's when you're feeling refreshed and you're going to have the best focus and ability to really internalize the material that you're reviewing and studying while doing questions. So you can see on our calendar here, we have kind of templated out the day by saying in the morning, we recommend doing at least 80 questions per day, typically in 2 40-question blocks, and making those, doing those questions and then making flashcards in association with the question. So you're really combining the two most active forms of learning there by doing questions and then making flashcards as needed to cover, to reinforce the material that you maybe got wrong or need to spend a little bit of extra time trying to memorize.
Yeah, and if you see on the next slide, it'll show it in more detail.
In a bigger box. So you
There
can see there, that's kind of the breakdown for the day. So you start by doing your questions in the morning, and then you review your questions in the afternoon. And then in the late afternoon, you can really hone in on those weaker topics, things that were identified if there was some gap in your knowledge that you needed to review.
Okay, so Emily, Dr. Zielinski, thank you so much for talking us through the initial part of our calendar. We're going to get back to this calendar and fill out the rest of it. But at this point, since we've talked a lot about active learning and about questions, I think it's the appropriate time to have the folks from UWorld and specifically Kelly Chopra talk about the UWorld platform and some of their comments on how to study. So Kelly, would you like to go ahead?
Thank you so much, Dr. Bruce Raymer and Dr. Zielinski. I love the calendar and how you can integrate UWorld into the studying. Just a quick note, I know that Dr. Bruce Raymer put it in the chat, but we are going to do Q&A at the very end. And so stay tuned. We'll take your questions and make sure that everything gets responded to either live or in the chat. Okay, so with UWorld, one of the biggest questions that we get the most frequently is how should you study? And we like to say that you should always study using a tried and true method. And most of you would probably be familiar with Aesop's fable, The Tortoise and the Hare. And just like the tortoise and the hare, that's how we think you should approach this USMLE Step 1 exam, your COMLEX 1 exam, even your Step 2 and COMLEX 2 level exams as well. So when you're in tortoise phase, which is really before dedicated, you're taking a systems-based approach to the Qbank, you're going slow and steady, you're working through it in tutor mode, you're building that knowledge foundation, and you're gonna work through both of your self-assessments that UWorld has given you along with your subscription. Once you hit dedicated, you change that approach into the hare approach, a little bit faster. So you're building your speed and stamina. You're taking a test-based approach to studying, which allows you to focus on those weaker areas like Dr. Zielinski just spoke about, and you're really continuing on with that comprehensive review. All right, so with that being said, all of you should have already been started in your Qbanks at this point. For those of you who have not, this is what your Get Started page looks like. For those of you who have already started and are knee deep in, you are very familiar with this page. So you'll notice that I have us started out in tutor mode. I'm going to choose all of the unused questions here. And the reason for that is that we really suggest that you get through all of the questions one time before you hit dedicated study. So you'll notice with the amount of questions that are in the bank, and I think today's count is over 3,800 for the Step 1 bank, that would take a lot of time and effort to get there before dedicated study. So we're going to click unused questions. We're going to choose all of the subjects. We're going to choose all of the systems. And what we're going to do with that is then we're going to go in and we're going to match your preclinical curriculum. So for instance, as you're going through this, you're going to work through each subject and system, how you're working through it with school. This is going to allow you to continuously do more and more questions as you're getting through school and really hone in and focus. So you can take this alongside of your studies, and then it doesn't feel like you're doing so much extra work just to prep for the USMLE. This is going to become, you know, secondhand studying, and this is just going to be how you get in the zone on a weekly basis prior to that dedicated. So for instance, with this one, we would choose pulmonary critical care. You can actually expand this a little bit further, and you can really drill down on this one. Again, if you were working through DI, you would go through the same thing, and you could expand this and drill down even further as you're working through this. And again, just like Dr. Zielinski showed you how you should do it, I'm just here to show you how it's actually done live in the Qbank. As we go through this, you'll notice that I'm actually going to come up and I'm going to put a question on the board. And if this is when we could put our polling into the screen, I'm going to allow you guys to read through this question. I'm going to give everybody 90 seconds and read through this question and see if you can come up with the best answer. You'll notice as we go through this that I have gone through and highlighted a couple key terms for you. Okay, we'll give about 20 more seconds. All right, Elena, is it going to allow us to see the questions or the answer choices?
So I've just answered the poll. I'm going to share the results just as.
Perfect. Okay, for those of you who chose B, CD4 T lymphocytes and macrophages, you got this correct. So you'll notice a couple of things when you answer a question correct in tutor mode. We're always going to tell you whether you got it correct or incorrect, how many people globally using this question got it correct as well, how much time we spent on the question, and last but not least, when this question was written. So you'll notice for the most part, all of our questions should never be later than 18 months old. Most of them that you'll notice have been 12 months old. If you come across a question that says collecting statistics, that means it's a brand new question. So it has only been live in the Qbank for just a little bit, and we don't have enough data to give you tried and true statistics on it. And one thing that you'll note about UWorld is we always like to give very true response and data back to our users. All right, so a couple of things before we move on from this question I wanted to show you was I did go in and highlight a couple of these key terms in this question. You'll notice in the settings that you have a couple of options in here. You can change the interface, you can go in and add the timer, you can do split screen explanations, you can use the default highlighter, but you can also use the multicolor highlighting tool, which I think is very interesting, and it's something new that we've done in the last 12 months. So this allows you to highlight different things in different colors. So when you're going back and reviewing questions, you can go back to these certain things and really hone in and highlight what it is that you were wanting to go back and repeat on these. All right, so let's go over the way that UWorld supplies the explanations to all of you. You'll notice that most of our explanations come with some sort of visual in the explanation. For instance, the one you're looking at here is done by our medical illustrators that work specifically with UWorld and not anywhere else. So everything that you see from visual tables, radiographic images, any illustrations, those are all proprietary to UWorld. So you will not see these anywhere else. You will always see these explanations. They will give it to you in visual form. We'll also give it to you in written form. So for those of you who are maybe not visual, but you are audio type learners, you'll be able to get these any way possible. We also always give you the incorrect answer choices and always an educational objective, which is two to three sentence summary of the question and the answer. Let's show you a different type of question. So you'll notice this one is with a radiographic image. Again, with this image specifically, and all of our radiographic images, these are proprietary to UWorld. We have heard from many radiologists that you will not find questions of this magnitude or visuals of this magnitude in other resources that you may be using. So you'll notice I've already gone in and answered this question for you. You'll notice once you start going through the question, we label not only the anatomy that the question was in reference to, but you will notice that we label all the surrounding anatomy too. And the reason that that's very important for you is because as you're going through those incorrect answer choices, we're actually showing you what that would have looked like in this image. So you're not only learning what the question and the correct answer was, but you're learning what the correct answer would have been if this had been the actual question. So I'll just show you a couple of these examples. And we'll get into now, how do you create custom flashcards with UWorld, and how do you use those to your biggest benefit? So you'll notice, as Dr. Bruce Raymer and Dr. Zielinski both mentioned before, as you're going through dedicated and you're doing questions and you're creating flashcards, this is something very personal to you. So this is something that allows you to copy and paste information onto these flashcards that is going to help you remember what was most important about this question. And the reason that this is really important is because as you start studying these flashcards, you are going to start to study with spaced repetition. You're going to be asked every time you work through a question to either rate it again, good, or easy. And with these, this is how it will dictate when you're working through flashcards, how often you see certain cards, certain decks. So you will see those again cards more frequently until you've mastered them. And as you start to get the master going, then you will change it to good and easy. And that's important because as you're working through this, you want to see improvement. And so you want to still see those easy flashcards, but the ones that you're maybe struggling with, let's get those on repeat pretty frequently so you can work through them and continue to get and build that knowledge. You'll notice on this that you also have your electronic notebook in UWorld. So you can go in and organize this, again, very personal to you, copy and paste any information. But again, you can also upload your own notes from, say, lecture or class, and really use UWorld as a one-stop shop on where all you can get your studying resources from. All right, so let's go to understanding your dashboard and why that's really important. So when you're working through your dashboard and you're looking at this page, you'll notice that on my page, it's showing 77% correct. I just want to let you all know that that is probably not what any of you are staring at today. Most of you are probably staring anywhere from 40% to about 58%. That is normal with UWorld. If you were sitting at 77% and you had a high number of questions answered and a high number of Qbank usage, I would say that you are probably test ready. If you are sitting between 40 to 55%, keep powering through. Reason is you will start to see this grow. You'll notice that 77% would mean you're sitting in the 81st percentile rank. This is absolutely normal for someone who is almost at test date. This is probably not someone who is still 6 months from test date. This is probably somebody who is in dedicated and they're working through their question bank in more of a timed test simulation mode. And so we're going to get through that right now. What does that look like? And what do you really think you should, or what we think you should be doing as you're working through the question bank? So a couple of things. Start early and practice often. So for those of you who might be sitting on a question bank because you're gun shy on, say, activating it because you only have a certain amount of time, I want you to think through that. There's 3,800 questions. So if you keep pushing off a start date, you may regret that in the long run because you may not be able to get through them in a smart way. And so that's one of the things that we talk about at UWorld is being a smart user versus a power user. A power user is just getting in, cranking out questions, not caring about the outcome. And they're thinking, gosh, if I can just get through these 3,800 questions, I'm going to be successful. That's not necessarily true. And honestly, it's a high probability of not being true. What we want you to do is be a smart user. And what that means is up until dedicated, use it in tutor mode. Really go through the questions, spend no more than about 3.5 minutes per question, and move on to the next. If you get the question right, move on. If you get the question wrong, review it for a couple minutes, and then move on to the next. Don't go down a rabbit hole. Don't grab other resources and start researching it. Really take the time to stay in the Qbank and keep working through it in a smart manner. When you get to dedicated, that's when you become the power user. That's when you focus on those weak areas first, but you're getting in exam simulation mode. So you know every week you're going to simulate your exam, if not more than once a week. And that is what we would say is the transition period from being a smart user to a power user. Again, like I mentioned, we want you to get through the bank one full time before dedicated, and then one during dedicated study. And then make sure, don't forget to customize that Qbank. Use your flashcards and your notebook. And then that brings you back to, I'm going to turn it back over to Dr. Bruce Raymer and Dr. Zielinski so they can help you finalize your 5-week calendar after you've kind of seen just a little tour of how we at UWorld recommend that you use it.
Thanks so much, Kelly. That was great. And this is a great tour of all the features in UWorld, which is, of course, an amazing Qbank and an amazing resource. Dr. Zielinski, let's continue talking about the study calendar and fill out the remaining components because we'd only filled out the first part of the day talking about question use and active learning. So maybe you want to just sort of walk us through the remainder, including how we distribute questions as we go through the calendar, because we have a little bit more information here on this slide than we did in the previous one.
Yeah, absolutely. So to piggyback off of what Kelly was saying, we do recommend typically doing tutor mode questions early on as you're getting prepared for your dedicated period, and even initially as you first start your dedicated period. So as you may notice on this calendar, although we've set a specific focus for the first 2 days of the study calendar being cardio, the next 2 being pulm, we're not specifying that you necessarily do all 80 questions each of those days focused on cardio alone. Because what ultimately you need to be thinking about during your dedicated period is that you want to be practicing how you plan to play, essentially, for a little sports reference. So you want to start doing questions in the environment that you're going to expect to be seeing them on test day. And so In order to ease you into that, you'll see that over the course of our 5-week calendar, we go from having questions in tutor mode during the first week to kind of transitioning and flipping the ratio, doing some tutor mode in the second week, doing more questions in timed mode, until ultimately in the last couple of weeks, you're doing all of your questions in timed mode. Throughout this 5-week calendar, we don't want you just doing cardio specific questions during each of these days. Doing a mixed bag of questions as you're preparing for your exam, because ultimately, unfortunately, on exam day, there's no cardio section followed by pulm section followed by GI section. It's all going to be jumbled together. And so over the course of 5 weeks, you want to get comfortable seeing every sort of question that might get thrown at you one after the other, so that your brain, if you're only doing cardio questions, it's going to be easy to assume that the correct answer is the cardiovascular related answer choice and not the pulmonary answer choice, or what have you. So going forward and building the rest of the calendar, we said that during the morning, we're going to be doing questions primarily, setting our target at 80 questions per day over the course of the 5 weeks, and making flashcards. Afternoon will be spent reviewing your questions. That's particularly relevant if you're doing timed question blocks, because you'll do your 2 timed question blocks and then review your questions. And then in the late afternoon, you might review some weaker topics. And that's where Kelly kind of said, avoid going into the rabbit hole while you're working through the question bank, get through the question set, and then you can kind of shore up some of the weaker spots in the late afternoon if there's something into more. In the evenings, we've kind of a specific schedule as far as what sort of video review sources you might want to use in the evening. Again, this is when your brain is kind of tired. You've been doing questions all day. You've been making flashcards. You've been kind of shoring up the weak spots. Now you can just watch a few videos, whatever resources you prefer to use, and then review your flashcards in the evening right before you go to bed to kind of round out your day. And I think on the next slide, you'll see that'll kind of zoom in for you for an example for the evening of what that might look like, doing a 1.5 to 2 hour video review, or 1 hour video review. I think. Can you go to the next?
We can go to the next slide.
Perfect. So you can kind of see on the zoomed in box there, we've got video review designated, cardiopathology for an hour, vascular pathology the next day, pulmonary pathology, etc., and then flashcard review in the evening to really round it out. Okay, next slide. And then lastly, as far as this calendar goes, we've added in check boxes too to help keep you accountable. So if some of you are type A, or most of you are type A like me, you might get a little thrill of adrenaline when you check off the box on what you need to do for the day. It gives you a sense of accomplishment, keeps you on track. So we've added check boxes so that you can print this calendar off to help you keep accountable as you are working through your dedicated period. And this study planner is really only useful if you use it. So there can be edits based on what, works best for you and what your specific weak areas are, and you can move the topics around if needed. But you want to make sure that you create a schedule, you're using a schedule, and you're sticking to a schedule. Because the hardest thing during your step 1 study period is listening to your friends and your peers talk about what they're doing, and then feeling like you need to up and change your schedule 2 weeks in and completely rework everything. Avoid that urge, fight it, because it will only set you back. You need to set a schedule, stick to it, and really kind of push forward and just move ahead in your study schedule, and know that kind of if you stick to the process, it will work for you. If you put in the time, you'll get the reward and you will pass your exam. And then, get some help sticking to your plan. It's really important to have friends, family, tutors if needed, people that you can study with that are kind of in your corner. It can be very isolating studying for step 1. Sometimes with these USMLE exams, you're in a dedicated period. You're not necessarily seeing your colleagues and classmates all the time. So make sure that you have some people that you are checking in with, just so you can, not feel like a study zombie and feel like you are still your same person and self. And then, make sure that you take time each day to do important things like eating, sleeping, exercise, going for a walk, whatever you need to kind of maintain your kind of good mental health and energy throughout this 5-week period. All right, next slide.
Okay, so we're just gonna wrap up, and I wanted to reiterate a slide we showed at the beginning of this presentation. Again, we've been talking about using active learning resources first and passive learning resources afterwards. I want to emphasize this again with this diagram here. Really, questions and the review of those questions are the key to learning. That is both during the dedicated study period and in the period leading up to it. I know that it can seem that that oftentimes you're told to read and do this reading and that reading and watch this video and listen to that lecture and then do the questions after you've reviewed it. However, medical school, your biggest enemy, or the thing that's most in shortage, is time. And the most efficient way to use that time is to use questions and to do the questions first and then to read and review afterwards. It may sound counterintuitive. It may be different than what you did in college. It's different than what I was told when I was in medical school many years ago. First, we had to read, and first we had to watch the videos and then do the questions. But the reality is, and the science of learning in medical school has shown consistently that questions, and high quality questions, the ones you're going to find in a UWorld Qbank, and those explanations that come along with it, those are going to be the key to learning really efficiently and really effectively, because they're going to target right away, automatically, your weakest areas. They're going to challenge you and engage you actively and mentally throughout the process. So we really want to make sure that you do that both during the dedicated, as our calendar shows, and also throughout medical school. You're going to find this is a much more efficient way to learn throughout, even if it seems a little bit different than what you're used to. So we can go to our next slide to wrap up. So we showed you this whole calendar, and we've now essentially officially made our new study planners available. Dr. Zielinski's walked you through this in great detail. These are obviously templates, and all calendars need some kind of personalization. All the people who are attending this webinar today are going to get a link to download the PDF version of this calendar, so you can do that. So if you can't wait to the end of the presentation, we're going to try to get a link to the calendars posted in the chat. So we'll try to get to that shortly. We can go to the next slide. And at this point, we have about 20 odd minutes left in the presentation. We wanted to, as we've been emphasizing at the beginning, we have time for Q&A, and Dr. Zielinski and I and Kelly at UWorld, we're all going to be available to answer your questions now. We have a Q&A. There's a Q&A feature in Zoom, so please make sure to use that. We're going to go through the questions. There are a lot of them already, but we should have time for additional questions on top of that. So please post them in the Q&A, and we'll do our best to answer them. Some of them, just so you know, may be combined because they're similar questions on the same thing. So without further ado, I think we can go to the Q&A.
So let's open it up. We'll answer some of these questions. And so I will give this over to you. I'm not sure if it'll be Dr. Zielinski or Dr. Bruce Raymer, but does the 5-week calendar have an average amount of study hours per day? If so, who can't, if students who can't meet this amount, how should they accommodate?
Yeah, absolutely. So yes, at the top of the 5-week calendar, we did not zoom in on this on the slide, but you will see it when you get the link and when you open up the PDF later. The 5-week calendar does assume that you're spending at least 10 hours studying per day, potentially up to 12 hours per day studying. So this is a true dedicated all-day study event in the 5 weeks that you have to prepare for step 1. If you are not able to dedicate or set aside a full day's worth of hours to study for step 1, then you may want to consider elongating your study period so that you can essentially get the same amount of time and hours over a longer period. And one thing that I think is super critical when you're preparing for any USMLE exam is just making sure that you're doing a high volume of questions every day. And the reason for that is because of that kind of spaced repetition that Kelly was mentioning. And you see this with flashcards too. If you're working in the material and you're seeing a high volume of questions each and every day, you're getting more and more comfortable with how to read questions, how to pick up on minor cues of how the questions are written to suggest that one answer choice is better than the next. And so those types of things you don't necessarily pick up on the patterns as well when you're doing just 20 questions per day or just studying for an hour or two at night. But that time early in the preclinical years when you're studying for your exams is really critical to build your knowledge base. But as you're preparing to sit for your exam, you really want to be in a dedicated period where you have a chunk of time to set aside for several weeks to just kind of be in exam mode and really prepare your mind so that you become very efficient at reading questions and answering them.
Great answer. Okay, next question, and I can take this one, is what's the minimum score on the first pass of UWorld you would suggest to pass step one? I personally think that if you have done one pass on the entire Qbank and you're sitting above a 65%, you should be feeling confident. However, again, several things go into play. And so I definitely think it's more than just the percentage. You've got to think about, test anxiety and things of that nature. So again, if you're sitting at 65% or higher, you should be test ready. But there's always room to keep improving that percentage. So if you have the time, keep using the time.
Yeah, I would concur with your thoughts, Kelly. That's a very, very accurate statement. One of the challenges I think that exists out there is that the NBME, the people who create the USMLE, have not released exact data on the percentage target score that we should be going for. So I think it's a very safe way to say you're test ready or within range for passing at minimum with a 65% correct. Dr. Zielinski, I don't know if you have anything to add on that.
No, I completely agree. I think it's hard to pinpoint a specific number, but I think 65 is probably a pretty fair estimate.
Perfect. And for those of you who might be wondering, UWorld is in the process of changing from that 3-digit scoring to a pass-fail. You'll notice on your simulation exams, that is a question that is going to come up. So just to kind of take the bull by the horns on that, as we get more and more data from the NBME on how the scoring for that pass fail is calculated, we will continue to update our Qbank. So for those of you who have had a Qbank for a little bit and have taken those simulations and it's populating a 3-digit score too, sit tight and hang tight with that, because that's still very accurate. The scoring, is still accurate for pass fail, as we know at this time. But just, early data coming back from that NBME is that more people are not passing on their first round. So again, time is of the essence and organization is of the essence on being prepared. Just because they went pass fail doesn't mean that they made it easier. It's actually looking like maybe they increased the difficulty just a little bit. So keep that in mind as you guys are working through this. All right, the next one we'll go with is, please provide advice with one of the most important strategies a person who has a huge problem with time management can do while sitting on the exam, or sitting for the exam is, I believe, what they meant.
Yeah. So I think time management is tricky for a lot of people. And as you know, when you have 40 questions you have to answer with a fairly long vignette at times, and then, you only have 60 minutes to do it, and maybe you want to try to review, it can feel very rushed at times. So the big strategies that I would recommend to try to help you with time management, first and foremost, is when you're going through your dedicated period, try to approach questions with a really targeted approach that's efficient. And so, a lot of times I have students that just read the question from top to bottom, get lost somewhere in the middle of the vignette, and then have to reread it 2-3 times before they select an answer choice. Try to get in the habit of not doing that, and instead read the last line of the question first, come up with a standardized approach for how you're going to work through questions, and practice that leading up to your exam, because that will help you be very efficient in your approach to each and every question that you are seeing. So read the last line of the question first, kind of skim the answer choices to get your kind of mindset as you read through the rest of the vignette, so that is this going to be a question about infections? Is this question going to be about drug mechanisms? What is this question going to be about? And then as you read the vignette, that can help give you the final details and clues you need to select the right answer choice. So that would be the first recommendation I have. The second would be on test day. There are some strategies you can do in terms of how you break up your question blocks, when you take your breaks, et cetera, so that you can make sure that you're rested. You have a minute in between if you get up and stretch your legs, or if you're just the kind of person who wants to sit in between the 8 blocks, if you just want to sit at your desk station and put your head down for a second, reset, and then get back into the next block, whatever you need to do. Those are some things to think about as far as time management goes. But the biggest thing, honestly, comes from practicing and getting comfortable with questions leading up to the exam and having a standardized approach so that you don't get lost in the mix of each question. I don't know, Dr. Bruce Raumer, if you have anything else you want to add there. That's my.
No, those are great. There's also what you're talking about, being time efficient on study day. There's also being efficient with the time you have to study when you're preparing. And that means setting aside time to do the questions and then time to review those questions. Sometimes we hear from students, oh, I've fallen into the rabbit hole. I did an hour worth of questions. I did a 40 question block, but now I spent 4 or 5 hours reviewing those questions. That may be too long. So what you really want to do is make sure that you do about an hour. If you're taking an hour to do the questions, a full block, that means you should probably have another hour or 2 to review those questions for a total of 3 hours, maybe even 4 hours if it's really something of key interest. So there's also being efficient in your study day. If you're doing them in tutor mode, that means then you're getting the answers right after. So you want to make sure that you allot yourself, say, 3 hours to do the 40 block question in tutor mode, because you're going to get the answers after each question. You want to be efficient in all aspects. Time really is going to be the enemy in both test day and also in your test preparation.
This is a good question. Could we go with these suggestions as IMGs as well as for only U.S. graduates?
Yeah.
And
so,
I believe the answer is yes to this. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, definitely. So I think as an IMG, I don't think that I have any major edits to the calendar, but I do think it's important as an IMG, and just honestly, as any medical student in the US, whether you're coming from an allopathic or an osteopathic program, to really sit down and kind of think about your preparation up to the point of your dedicated period. Were you really invested in your preclinical years? Do you feel like you have a good knowledge base going into your dedicated block? If you're not very confident, and the things that can help you be more confident are looking at your test scores leading up to your dedicated block for each of your courses and your preclinical material. Were you scoring well on your exams leading up to that point, or were you kind of barely passing each of those exams? You can use those as sort of markers to tell you, how solid is my knowledge base going into my dedicated period. And although, again, to Kelly's point, USMLE did make step 1 pass fail, but we are seeing an increased rate of failures actually on step 1. And part of that, could be multifactorial, people not studying quite as much for step 1 as they had been in the past, the exam structure changing. I don't know from the NBME side of things, but I think it's important to remember that, you do want to pass this exam, but you're also trying to learn this material because you are hopefully going to be a doctor and be treating patients. And although some of it can seem mundane and really minutia for the test, it all comes back. I mean, I'm still thinking about erythromycin mechanism of action, even as an orthopedic surgeon today. So there are times where the drug mechanism of action comes into play, and you want to remember those things. And so I just would really encourage you to critically think about, your preparation up to your dedicated period. And if you don't feel really confident in your knowledge base, then you may want to consider extending your study period for an additional 4 or 5 weeks to really allow you extra time to spend really honing in on some of the weaknesses and kind of relearning material as needed.
Great. Okay, let's see. Let's go with the next question is, when should they switch from system mode to mixed question mode? Would that be before dedicated or during dedicated?
My personal recommendation would be to switch to a mixed mode at the start of your dedicated block, because again, you want to kind of practice like you're going to play or how you're going to see the questions on test day. And you want to have a good, 4 to 5 weeks of a high volume of questions where everything, all encompassing types of questions, so that you're not automatically selecting answer choices because you know that the answer is going to be myocardial infarction because you are in a cardiovascular block, for example. So I would recommend doing all of your questions in a mixed mode starting in your dedicated block, unless you're kind of opt for a longer study schedule that's going to be, up to 10 weeks, then you might have the first half of your study schedule still be systems-based specific.
Okay, we've got really good questions. A couple of things to note on this. We are going to be sending a recording of this out to everybody, as well as a follow-up email from Elite Medical Prep and UWorld together. There will be an option in there to sign up for UWorld discount for anybody who is still wanting to purchase UWorld. If you have not already purchased it, we've gotten that question several times. So I just wanted to let everybody know that. The next question is, how can you condense the 5-week calendar to 3 weeks?
So I think if you were going to condense the 5-week calendar to 3 weeks, that would probably assume that you would want to try to increase the overall volume of questions that you're doing per day. So instead of doing 80 questions per day, I would recommend doing at least 120 questions per day. And under kind of the outline that Dr. Bruce Romer gave, you would, if you're doing the questions on tutor mode and you're doing 120 questions per day, I would plan to spend 3 hours per block as a kind of maximum as you're working through those questions. But you're more than likely in a 3-week period, most of your blocks should be in timed mode, maybe aside from that initial first week or first couple of days as you're kind of getting into doing questions again, or doing questions at a higher volume or rate rather in mixed mode. So then if you're doing timed mode, obviously you have 1 hour to complete the block. And then I would try to set aside, 1.5 hours afterwards to review and make flashcards as needed. The biggest thing with a 3-week block is just making sure that you are taking regular practice exams if you're going to shorten your block. So I would still recommend taking 3 full-length practice exams to ensure that you're kind of at or near passing rate before you sit for your exam.
That's great. Now we're going to shift a little bit. And so we've got several questions, Dr. Zielinski and Dr. Bruce Romer, on self-assessments. So this is, I'm going to combine a few of the questions. Should they take MBME safe assessments and UWorld assessments, just one or the other? And then how many of those should they take prior to sitting?
I can take this question. So I think as Dr. Zielinski pointed out, during the dedicated study period, you want to take at least 3 practice exams. That means then this is the minimum. That means a baseline and 2 additional practice exams at least. On our calendar that Dr. Zielinski helped to develop, I think we have 4 or 5 practice exams. So basically a baseline plus 1 every week, and then leading up to the actual exam. Now the question is, which exams to take. There are a lot of NBME exams, and there are also 2 UWorld self-assessments. On our study calendar, if you look in detail, you'll see that the first few are going to be NBMEs, and then we're going to incorporate both UWorld self-assessments 1 and 2. Now, you might ask, well, the NBME writes the test. Why would you use the UWorld self-assessment instead of the NBME? There's a really clear answer, and it's really interesting. The NBME has been constantly updating their practice exams, and the variability in those exams has increased over the last couple of years. And some of those practice exams are considered harder or less hard, and so the scores are not as well validated. But UWorld self-assessment 1 and self-assessment 2 have essentially stayed steady. And I know from speaking to my colleagues at UWorld, both with Kelly and with people who are on the development side of actually developing those exams, that they're very careful about setting up those exams and making sure that the difficulty level has remained consistent throughout. It's really a very careful process from what I understand. And what's great about those UWorld self-assessments is we now have a long history. We're talking about 10 plus years of sort of assessing how people are performing on them. So I think it's great to mix in the NBMEs, which are produced by the NBME, who writes the tests. They write the test, so you should definitely take their practice exams, but also the UWorld self-assessments. The bonus here, the UWorld self-assessments come with really good answer explanations, just like a UWorld Qbank. So essentially, you're getting extra Qbank practice questions in a mixed format and in time format. So that would be my recommendation on this, on how to balance those 2 things out.
Perfect. Okay, I've got one that I'll go ahead and answer for UWorld. But it is, has UWorld been updating its questions to reflect the changes in question style and structure and focus on step 1 since the pass-fail change? This is actually actively being done actually as we speak. So you'll start to notice that some of the structure style of the questions with UWorld are going to change. So you'll notice some of the questions are going to be more chart-like and that are coming into the Qbank. And so you'll start to notice that UWorld will have questions that are written in a little bit different than the current clinical vignettes. We'll have both types of questions in the question bank. Also, just something to note for those further steps that you'll take, basic sciences are being added back to the step 2 and to the step 3. So these are all really great things that as you're building your flashcards and your notes in UWorld, as you continue to get the other question banks, you can link your account. And so you can make sure you always have the flashcards from your previous question bank, which would help, as the style of question changes as well. And that pass fail is definitely something that's first and foremost on our mind. And then we'll always keep the bank as up to date as possible to make sure that everybody has the best study experience. Okay, let's go to another one. Oh, a lot of these, I believe that we have already gotten to.
We could address the question about if you want to take more than 5 weeks to study.
Yep, perfect.
So I can start it off, and then maybe Dr. Zielinski, you can kind of talk about this. So what we presented today was the 5 week, our 5 week study calendar, which actually has a six week in place, and that's kind of a bonus. But there's a question I've seen repeatedly come up: what if I needed a longer period of time for dedicated, or I have a longer dedicated period, or I've had trouble in the past, I'm on a retake, or I'm coming from abroad, and I think I'm going to need much more time. So we actually are in the midst of developing, and we'll soon be releasing a 10-week study calendar. And there's obviously you could double the 5 week calendar. You could take it and just do it twice. That would be one option. But maybe Dr. Zielinski, you want to talk about some of the principles of a longer calendar and maybe the approach for who that would be relevant for.
Yeah, absolutely. So like we alluded to a little bit earlier, if you feel like your knowledge base is not quite where it's at, or maybe you don't have 10 to 12 hours per day for 5 weeks to dedicate to studying for USMLE Step 1, the 10-week calendar may be a better option for you. And the 10-week calendar was essentially devised under the pretense that, again, most schools will allow students 6 weeks of dedicated time. And then sometimes you can sort of finagle your clinical clerkship schedule to allow you to have an 4 weeks, maybe as an elective block or a vacation month or something like that, that you can tack on to your dedicated period if needed, to allow you to have up to 10 weeks to study for Step 1 and allow you to have maximal chance at success. So that was kind of the premise of the 10-week calendar. And within the 10-week calendar, we essentially have set it up so that the first 4 weeks are dedicated to really a more intensive topic review, where you would be doing systems specific question blocks. So like 40 questions on cardio, 40 questions each day, the next day on pulm, et cetera. But with more days allotted to review each of the highest kind of hitting topic areas. So cardio, pulmonary, renal, neuro, et cetera. With a focus that kind of spreads out over the, I think it's 6 to 7 weeks of the calendar. And then as you kind of work through the calendar, you'll switch at about that halfway point from doing system specific questions to doing, one block of system specific questions, maybe on biochemistry, for example, and then another 40 question block doing mixed questions. So we kind of start to transition then into the 5 week calendar that we shared with you here, where you're really, again, practicing like you plan to play, doing mixed questions, getting some familiarity with that, and timed questions to prepare you as you go into your exam. And again, the practice exams then are still built into the 10-week calendar with a goal of doing at least 3 practice exams, but we build in, I believe, 5 or 6 into the 10-week calendar, although you're not taking a practice exam every week in the 10-week calendar, because you have the first 2 weeks to really study and kind of get through some more questions, get through some material before you would take your first practice exam beyond the baseline, essentially. So it's just a little bit more drawn out if you need to allow you some extra time to really delve into the topics that you need to strengthen.
Yeah, and I think I've seen some questions that once this is finished up with on the development side, preparing the final version of that, we'll make it available and alert people via email, social media, and other outlets as well. And keep in mind, really the key throughout this, like the 5-week, there's not much difference. It's going to be lots of questions, and that means lots of UWorld. So UWorld is really going to be the key and be the core of what you're going to be doing. Questions, regardless of the length of your preparation. It's really about focusing on question-based learning. That is going to be your best way to learn.
Perfect. Okay, I think we have time for one more question. And I think I want to go back to the self-assessments just really quick. To follow up on the practice exams, is there a particular order you recommend doing the assessments, or just taking any 3 as they please?
Dr. Zielinski, you want to go ahead? I think you're probably better suited for answering this.
Yeah, so I think as far as the practice exams go, I would prioritize taking an NBME earlier, doing an NBME as your baseline, and then doing an NBME as your initial practice exam beyond that, and then kind of mixing in your 2 UWorld self-assessments from there. So taking either both UWorld assessments after your initial baseline. If you're only going to take 3 exams, I would prioritize the UWorld self-assessments because those scores are, like we said, highly representative of kind of what your expected score would be. And again, I know Kelly mentioned that the actual score report is changing to be more reflective of the new pass-fail design, but those numbers that you'll be receiving are very accurate and should be most predictive. And then the other thing to consider, though, is that with the NBME, they have changed the way that their practice exams are presenting data. So I recommend that for the baseline exam, you take an NBME because we do kind of say with our 5-week calendar that we would not recommend sitting for your USMLE exam unless you're scoring at around a 90% likelihood of passing step 1 week before your exam. So you kind of want to make sure that you're sandwiching. I would start your baseline exam with an NBME because they will give you a % likelihood of passing. And if your % likelihood of passing step 1 within a week of taking that baseline is less than 70%, it may be wise to consider taking a little bit more time to study for step 1. And then taking your UWorld self-assessments in the middle, and then just making sure that you take an NBME right as you lead into your exam so that you're kind of at around that 90% mark to feel really confident going into your exam. That would be my recommendation, just given the switch from pass-fail.
Right. Keep in mind, this is what Dr. Zielinski just mentioned is likelihood to pass. This is not % correct on the question. So those are 2 separate percentages and can be confusing. We're talking about likelihood to pass, % correct. As Kelly mentioned earlier in the presentation, we generally think about 65% or higher % correct. That suggests you're probably you're in the passing zone. But then, of course, on these NBME practice exams, they're going to give you a likelihood to pass and another percentage. So don't confuse the 2 things. Okay.
I think as we need to respect everybody's time, that we should probably wrap it up. I will say on behalf of UWorld, thank you so much. We feel really honored that you guys spent the last hour with us, and we hope that you found it as informative as we wanted you to. You will specifically get an email follow-up with the recording of the webinar, as well as some information on if you need to purchase UWorld, how you can go about doing that. So on behalf of UWorld, thank you so much, and then I'll turn it back over to Dr. Zielinski and Bruce Raymer to give their final words.
Yeah, I just want to echo Kelly's comments. Thank you so much.